So I've been asked to teach one session of a series of classes on financial anxiety. Brendan, a friend of mine who is the priest down in Wilsonville at St. Francis, has written some books on financial anxiety. And he's not able to show up for a class, and he asked if I would cover it. And he specifically asked me, will you please teach a class on the connection between liberation theology and financial anxiety? And I texted him back and I said, I'm not sure what that connection is. And the reason is because liberation theology, a theology that rose out of Latin America, that comes from the voices of people who have experienced significant economic oppression at the hands of their own governments, at the hands of the church, at the hands of foreign powers such as ourselves. Liberation theology basically says that if you look at scripture, God always has what's called an option for the poor. God always, when push comes to shove, God is always going to choose the side of the vulnerable. In a world where we create sides, God is always going to stand on the side of the one who is being oppressed, the one who is a victim of violence, of persecution, of economic slavery. God is always going to stand on their side and say, this is unjust. This is wrong. And I am calling you, my people, to a practice of justice where everybody has enough to eat, where everybody has enough food stored up in their own barns that they can feed their families. And yet in our culture, in our world, we are the rich fool. Everything around us teaches us to be the rich fool. Save your money in an IRA or a 401k, buy property to make sure that you have something tangible that can then be sold, assuming the price of that sale is going to go higher, so that you can make money, that you can provide for your family, for your children. Store as much as you can. Churches build huge endowments of millions of dollars if they're capable. We have socked away a relatively small amount of money, but it is still put in two accounts that we never touch. And everything around us says that that's how we need to live, right? If we don't, who's going to care for us? We don't live in a world where there is a social safety net that cares for us particularly well. We always are worried about whether Social Security is going to disappear, right? We don't have a culture where families always care for one another, or rather, the white dominant culture doesn't have a culture where families always care for one another. We don't have a world set up where there's always a place for those of us who are growing older. We don't have a world set up where if we lose our jobs and everything around us, that someone, whether it's family or our village or our town or our city or our state or our nation, is going to necessarily support us. And so we focus on individual savings, which is where our personal anxiety comes from, right? Our financial anxiety is all about whether we will be able to provide for ourselves and for our loved ones. And there's nothing actually wrong with that desire to care and provide for support for those that we love, to make sure that no one is going to end up unable to feed themselves or their family. And yet, our society is constructed around doing this for ourselves as individuals, right? As individual persons, or maybe an individual community, an individual congregation, an individual town or village or society. And that is where it's hard to mesh God's constant and steadfast advocacy for those who are vulnerable with the way in which we handle our personal finances, the way in which we handle money, whether it's as individuals or as a church. It's hard to put those things together because, like the rich fool, when we get a plethora of things, when all of a sudden there's a windfall from the stock market, or a property was sold and suddenly we have more money, our first instinct is to actually do what this man does. It doesn't even seem strange to us. Like, well, if you have extra, of course, save it up, put it away somewhere safe so that we can eat, drink, and be merry. Or at least, if we don't want to admit to be eating and drinking and being merry, well, it's just put away for a harder time, a safer time when we need that for our safety. And yet, the problem with what this man does, Jesus calls it greed. The greed of this man is not that he was saving up some for his family. The problem is that by keeping this incredible windfall of food to himself, he was making sure that all of those around him, those who likely were the laborers that actually farmed his land and harvested his food, by keeping that food out of their hands, by keeping it out of the market where it could be traded and sold and shared with those around him, by keeping it away from the vulnerable, he was actually creating more vulnerability, more poverty. In the Gospel of Luke, the rich are never models of good behavior. Luke is adamantly a gospel which begins with Mary's cry of the victory of justice over God, where the poor will be lifted up and the rich will be brought low. It's a hard gospel because it insists that the way in which wealth is so often made is at the expense of the vulnerable. And that is the failure that we all can't help but participate in. We cannot help, if we're going to survive in our particular culture and our particular society, we cannot help but engage in the kind of behavior that seems completely normal to this rich man. Saving more, holding more. We're not a people that hears particularly well Jesus's command to give everything we have away. I know one person in my entire life who has actually tried to do that. And it was really hard for her. It was really hard for her, and she didn't do it for very long. Because it's hard to survive in the world around us when you have nothing, when you don't have possessions. And yet, the call, the reminder of Jesus is that if we hold on to things, to stuff, if we stock it up so much so that we deprive others of it, we're not focusing on God. We're focusing on possessions as if they will save us, rather than, the text says, God. And it's important that we understand here that it isn't because God is angry or that we owe kind of God a debt. But this is a circumlocution. It's a way of talking about who God is for. God is always on the side of those who are vulnerable. That doesn't mean that God is always against those who are not vulnerable. What God is always against is any way in which we participate in making people more vulnerable. God always stands against that. And it doesn't matter if we too have experienced vulnerability and persecution and injustice, because the reality is we all also participate in forms of injustice around us. God is always inviting us to think again about how we use what we have. Are we using it on behalf of those in need? I seriously wonder, as we think about the savings accounts that some of our largest churches have, the endowments that they have at the buildings that we made, even if we don't have a savings account, we still built a building. What if some of that money, instead of going into an endowment or a large building that is now difficult and expensive to care for, what if over the last 200 years. Instead, we had always said, we have some extra. We have more than what we need right now to do well. Can we give it away? Can we give it to somebody else who might need it? Can we allow them to eat, drink, and be merry? One of the things that I love about this passage is it doesn't actually condemn eating and drinking and being merry. It doesn't condemn the reality that the way that the things that we have actually bring us joy and comfort and the ability to celebrate one another. It condemns holding that off from other people. What if we had created a world where we didn't focus as much on saving, on stocking away for some dangerous time, but instead has always made sure that whatever extra, whatever abundance we had, always went to those who didn't have the same extra and the same abundance? What would that have done for their lives? How much greater stability would that have given them in their families? What kind of family stability and generational wealth would have been able to be passed down? And so when we think about this text, and when we think about Jesus's call constantly to always be aware of how we use our things for ourselves and for others, for those who are vulnerable, we need to pause and ask the question, do we have enough? Do we have enough for what we need? Is what we have really what we need? Are there ways that we can better share it for those around us? That is what it means to be after God in this text. That's what it means to put our heart and minds on God. It's not some kind of pious, well, if you just pray more, instead of worrying about possessions, then it's okay. It's about possessions being used for those who need it. We can't spiritualize this text. We can't decide that this is just about being more pious and holy, which makes kind of our possessions okay. That somehow the problem of the man was that he just didn't focus on God enough. No, the problem is that he took the abundance that he had, the amazing overflow of God's grace in the world, and he kept it for himself instead of sharing it. That is the call of this gospel. To recognize the abundance of God in the world around us. And instead of assuming that it is for us and for our safety, it is for the safety of all of those around us. Whether they're in our family or our clan or our tribe or our race or not, it is the call to always make sure that there are no vulnerable in the world, that there is no one who goes without food and shelter, without education, without health, to ensure that everybody can eat and drink and be merry. Amen.